I was thrown out of my own home with nothing but a suitcase, only to discover a weapon hidden in my purse and a death squad closing in on the highway. I didn't know it then, but my husband's mother hadn't just ruined my marriage. She had framed me for a crime that carried an enormous term behind bars. The rain was lashing against the windshield of my SUV like a physical assault, blurring the neon signs of the highway rest stops into streaks of angry light. My breath hitched in my throat as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning bone white. Just an hour ago, I had been sitting in the dining room of the home I shared with my husband, Mark, feeling like the luckiest woman in the world. Now I was in exile, thrown out with nothing but the clothes on my back and a single suitcase Mark had tossed into the driveway before locking the front door. It had started with the MIL scandal, as I'd come to call it, though in reality it was a calculated demolition of my existence. My mother-in-law, Elena, had never liked me. To her, I was an intruder, a middle-class girl who had trapped her precious son. For months she had been whispering lies into his ear, planting seeds of doubt about my character, my finances, and even my loyalty. But today, she had outdone herself. She had presented Mark with a folder of doctored documents, fake bank statements and fabricated texts that made it look like I was involved in an organized scheme to embezzle from his firm. When I tried to defend myself, Mark wouldn't even look me in the eye. He looked past me, his face a mask of cold, hollow betrayal, while Elena stood behind him, clutching her pearls with a triumphant, venomous smile. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't ask for the truth. He simply pointed to the door. "Get out," he had whispered, his voice devoid of the warmth that had defined our 3 years of marriage. "I don't know who you are, but you aren't the woman I married." Now parked on the shoulder of the interstate, the engine ticking as it cooled in the humid air, I felt the sheer weight of my isolation. I had moved across the country to be with Mark. I had no family nearby, no local friends who wouldn't be intimidated by the power his family held in this city. I checked my phone for the 100th time. No missed calls, no texts, no apology. My bank accounts, the ones I shared with him, were already frozen. I was stranded with less than $50 in cash and a car that was technically leased in his name. I turned the key to start the car, but nothing happened. A sickening mechanical groan erupted from the dashboard, followed by absolute terrifying silence. My battery was dead. Panic, sharp and cold, began to coil in my chest. I looked out into the darkness. There were no lights for miles, just the impenetrable wall of pine trees lining the highway and the occasional flash of a semi-truck flying past, its headlights briefly illuminating the desolate interior of my cabin. I reached for my purse to find my phone charger, but my hand brushed against something cold and metallic, hidden deep in the side pocket. Something that definitely didn't belong to me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled it out. It was a burner phone, its screen taped over with black electrical tape, and beside it a heavy, cold object wrapped in a silk scarf. I unwrapped it with trembling fingers, gasping as I realized what it was: an illegal weapon. My mind spun. How did this get into my bag? This wasn't just a divorce. This was a setup. Elena hadn't just kicked me out. She had planted evidence that could put me away for decades. If I were caught by the police right now, with this in my possession, it wouldn't just be an unfortunate misunderstanding. It would be a nightmare. I looked toward the highway, and my blood turned to ice. A black sedan had slowed down behind me, its hazard lights pulsing in the dark. It wasn't a patrol car. It was the same vehicle I had seen circling our block for the past week, the one I had dismissed as a neighbor's guest. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. his face obscured by the shadow of a tactical cap. He wasn't walking like someone coming to help. He was moving with the precision of a predator closing the distance. My phone pinged, a single chilling message from an unknown number. "We know what you're carrying. Open the door or we'll open it for you." I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the passenger door, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The man outside didn't rush. He moved with a terrifying, rhythmic calm, his boots crunching rhythmically on the wet gravel of the shoulder. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to scream, to run, to pray for a passing patrol car. But the sheer weight of the illegal weapon in my lap paralyzed me. I wasn't just a woman in the middle of a messy marriage split anymore. I was a pawn in something much darker. The stranger reached my driver's side door and pressed his face against the glass. Even in the gloom, I could see his eyes, cold, dead, and entirely devoid of human empathy. He tapped a gloved finger against the window. It wasn't a knock. It was a command. I stared at the burner phone in my lap, the screen now illuminated with a second message. "Hand over the bag or the service of the internal security will find you with that item, and you will face an enormous term behind bars." My mind raced, trying to bridge the gap between Elena's petty cruelty and this. Could she really be connected to a criminal network? Was the MIL scandal just a cover to get me on the road, alone, with this damning evidence, all to ensure I disappeared quietly into the justice system? It was a masterful, cruel stroke. If I was pulled over by the authorities with these items, I'd be facing an accusation of a most serious nature, a charge that would destroy my life forever. But if I gave the man what he wanted, I was admitting I was part of their dirty business. The man didn't wait. He drew something from his jacket, a tool meant for bypassing locks, and jammed it into the seam of my door. I knew then that I had seconds before the barrier between me and my executioner dissolved. I scrambled into the back seat, grabbing my suitcase, and punched the lock for the rear door. As the front door groaned and clicked open, I threw my weight against the opposite side, tumbling out into the freezing rain and mud. The darkness swallowed me immediately. I didn't look back to see him reach into the car. I just ran, my heels sinking into the soft earth, my lungs burning with the sharp metallic tang of the storm. I scrambled up the embankment, tearing my dress on the jagged pine branches, desperate to put distance between myself and the black sedan. Behind me, I heard the car door slam, then the distinct heavy crunch of footsteps following me into the woods. I fell, sliding down a muddy slope, and landed hard in a ravine. The silence of the forest was absolute save for the rain. I held my breath, clutching the stolen burner phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My flashlight app flickered on, a mistake I realized too late, and the beam cut through the foliage. Across the gully, barely 20 feet away, the man stood, looking directly at me. But he wasn't alone. Another figure stepped out from behind a tree, holding a satellite phone to his ear. "She's off the road, sir," the man whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the damp air. "She has the package and she's seen the faces. The internal security team is 3 minutes out. Should we neutralize, or do we wait for the authorities to find the illegal items on her?" I realized then that I had been played from every direction. I wasn't being hunted by enemies of the state. I was being hunted by the very people who were supposed to protect the law. Elena hadn't just kicked me out. She had handed me over to a group that needed a fall girl to cover their trail. As the distant, mournful wail of a siren began to bleed into the sound of the rain, the man with the phone stepped toward me, his hand reaching for his belt. Then, from the darkness behind me, a blinding spotlight erupted, pinning all of us to the slope, and a voice boomed through a megaphone. "Drop the items and put your hands where we can see them." My heart sank. I didn't know if these were the officers who would save me or the ones who had signed my death warrant. The light was blinding, a harsh artificial sun that made the rain look like falling needles of silver. I shielded my eyes, paralyzed by the conflict unfolding in the ravine. The two men stood frozen, their arrogance suddenly replaced by the twitchy uncertainty of cornered animals. One of them, the one who had been holding the satellite phone, glanced at the officer approaching from the ridge and made a split-second decision. Instead of raising his hands, he tossed a small black drive, which I hadn't even realized he was holding, into the dense underbrush near my feet. "They're with her!" the man screamed at the approaching figures, his voice dripping with practiced malice. "She's the one they've been tracking. She's carrying the dangerous cargo." He was trying to flip the script, to paint me as the perpetrator of a grave, state-level offense. My pulse was a frantic bird in my throat. I looked down at the mud beside me. The drive was tucked into a tuft of wet grass, reflecting a single pulsating red light. Without thinking, I snatched it up, shoved it into my coat pocket, and scrambled further into the shadows of the ravine, just as the figures, 3 men in tactical gear, descended. I didn't stick around to see the confrontation. I knew that the internal security team they had mentioned was likely the very group these men belonged to. If I surrendered, I would be silenced before I ever saw a courtroom. I crawled through the muck, following the slope downward until I reached a narrow, forgotten maintenance road. My lungs were screaming, and the cold had seeped into my marrow, but the sheer adrenaline of survival fueled my legs. I ran until the sirens grew faint, until I reached a dimly lit gas station 5 miles down the road, shivering, covered in mud, and looking exactly like the nightmare they wanted me to be. I ducked into the bathroom, locked the door, and pulled out the burner phone in the drive. The phone was buzzing incessantly. I ignored the threats and navigated to the files. It wasn't just a setup. It was an archive of years of corruption. Elena's family hadn't just been rich. They were the financial engine for a massive network involved in illicit trade and high-level deception. Every bank statement she had doctored was there, along with proof of how they had manipulated the authorities to clear their path. It was all there, stored in a digital vault that could dismantle their entire empire. I didn't call the local police. I knew better now. Instead, I remembered a journalist I had met through a volunteer project years ago, a woman who specialized in exposing systemic rot. I used the burner phone to send a burst transmission of the files to her secure server, along with my location. Then I turned the phone off and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, a discreet, unmarked vehicle pulled up to the station. It wasn't the police. It was a team from an independent federal oversight committee, alerted by my contact. They didn't arrest me. They protected me. Over the next few months, the MIL scandal shifted from a pathetic divorce tactic into a headline-dominating federal investigation. Elena and Mark were hauled in before a grand jury, their arrogance shattering the moment they realized their untouchable status had evaporated. The evidence I had recovered was the final nail. The organized network they were part of collapsed under the weight of the testimonies they were forced to give against each other to avoid a gargantuan prison term. I sat in the back of a safe house, months later, watching the news. Mark's face was on the screen, looking small, pale, and broken as he was escorted into a detention center. Elena was nowhere to be found, already having fled the country, only to be caught at a border crossing days later. I felt nothing. Not joy, not sorrow, just a profound, hollow sense of clarity. I had been kicked out onto the highway with nothing, intended to be a ghost in the justice system. Instead, I had become the architect of their downfall. I tossed the glass of water I was holding into the sink, picked up my new identification card, and walked out the door. The past was a closed book, and for the first time in years, the road ahead was finally, beautifully, my own.